welcome back. So I'm taking a look at the final section of The Wasteland, What the Thunder Said. This is an unusual section, perhaps in some ways. It doesn't fit into, it's not so immediately personal as the other sections. There is a feeling of it being more constructed in a careful way. Eliot said what he's got to say, more or less. Poured out his heart, its sufferings, its depression with the modern world, and now he's got to end it somehow in a satisfactory way. But what can he do? Can he pretend that there is a resolution and say, okay, the rains came and the drought went and now we're all happy? No, later on he will come to a position of faith, but he wasn't even at that stage when he wrote The Wasteland. So he has to find a way of ending the poem which is satisfactory, but at the same time keeps his own integrity intact. So I think he does a pretty good job with it, and kind of achieves that. However, it's a little bit self-conscious, and perhaps there's not as much good poetry here as in the other sections. Of course, it can't really be compared to Death by Water, as that section is too short. But I think the other sections of the poem are definitely more heartfelt, and there is better poetry in them, and they're more standalone. Perhaps this is a movement that's going to finish the work. It's rather like a symphonist who has poured his heart out in a slow andante and is then expected to write grand allegro to finish, but doesn't really feel it in his heart. So the job of Eliot then is to remain true to his own vision, and yet at the same time end the poem in a satisfactory way. I think he achieves it reasonably well. This part then opens with visions of the wasteland and its aridity, lack of water, the cracked landscape, and the sneering faces looking out of cracked mud brick buildings, and there is a mountain path leading always upwards, and the search for water, looking around for water that cannot be found. There's a talk of hordes of hooded men, large groups of them in movement, and the murmur of maternal lamentation, falling towers, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London. They seem to be armies of men fighting, and Eliot appears to be talking about the way in which history is a kind of cycle. One empire comes, another one goes, cities flourish and then they disappear, but new cities appear. There are always the armies killing each other. The names change, but it's always basically the same thing: suffering, dukkha, the mothers lamenting the deaths of their sons. No change. This is a land of suffering. Then in the mountains, Eliot finds a chapel, or Eliot finds a speaker, discovers a chapel, and we're told in the notes that this is a chapel perilous, which is connected with the Grail myth, and it's the last stage of the Grail myth. It's something that the knight, a test that the knight has to get beyond before he can have success. The last test. And there is thunder in the air, but it doesn't bring rain. However, a cock on the roof of the chapel starts to crow, cocorico, cocorico, and we are told that rain comes. However, we don't hear anything about the effect of the rain, and immediately cut to ancient India, where Eliot tells us the Ganga was sunken. The Ganga is the Ganges River, and it's sunken means there is no rain. It's dry. It's arid. They're waiting for rain, and over the Himalayas. There is thundercloud. There are thunderclouds and the expectancy of rain. And Eliot actually makes use of a story from the Upanishads here about the demons, the men, and the gods asking Shiva, the supreme god, really, of Hinduism, for his advice on what's important in life. And he says the word da, but they all hear something different. So one group hears datta, which means give, and Eliot talks about the awful daring of a moment's surrender, and how we will always remember that moment of generosity, dana in Pali, and we won't hear about our generosity in our obituaries, and we shouldn't hear about it in the wills we leave behind. It should be something we do during our lives. So one group hears this, and then the thunder speaks again, Dayatvam, and this means karuna, or compassion. So have karuna, have compassion. Bodhicitta in Buddhist terms. It's closely connected really to giving. And finally it speaks a third time and says Damyata, which means self-control. Have self-control. Control yourself. It's not too far away perhaps from the Buddhist idea of anicca, dukkha, anatta, how everything is impermanent, everything gives rise to suffering, and everything is uncontrollable. So don't be selfish and try to understand the nature of reality. So after this, Eliot embarks on a whole series of references to poets from the UK, from Europe, from France. John Webster is Spanish tragedy. Thomas Kidd is in the references to philosophers who have been important for Eliot, like Bradley. Is in the references to Tennyson with The Swallow, and finally he says, "These fragments I have shored against my ruin." And this is one of the most important lines in the poem, really, because he's saying that what he's done is something of a fragmentary nature, because in the modern age it's impossible to create a unified whole, and one can only hope to do something that's worthwhile by connecting to the traditions of the past. Right towards the end there's a reference to London bridges falling down, a nursery rhyme, and Hieronimo is mad again, reference to the Spanish tragedy by Thomas Kidd. So it seems perhaps that the actual sanity of the speaker is breaking down in the wasteland. There is also reference to the Fisher King again, with the arid plain behind him, So the rain seems to really have had no effect. There was a reference to it coming, but we haven't actually heard anything about it or its effect, either where the chapel was or in India. So it seems like Eliot can only suggest possibilities for salvation, possibilities that can give meaning to this life, and it's interesting that he should go to a Hindu myth for the most central uh, part of the section, and should talk about these qualities of giving, generosity, and self-control. I think it's been pretty apparent throughout the wasteland that people have no self-control most of the time, and they're selfish. They don't show generosity. They're certainly not giving, and they have no compassion for one another either. So whatever the religion he might eventually take as his own, and it's Christianity, it will be Christianity, there's still the fact that these three qualities are important to anyone who wants to move beyond the wasteland. And that's true from a Hindu point of view, it's true from a Buddhist point of view, it's true, I suppose, from a Christian point of view too. There are lots of Christian references in the section too, at the beginning, about someone who is that man who walks beside you. That's possibly a reference to Jesus appearing to the disciples, and some of the disciples, and they didn't know him. Possibly references to Jesus's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane when he asks for the cross to be taken from him. So, general points really. Eliot suggesting that the only possibility of getting out of this mess is through religious truths. But I think at this stage he's not really sure which religion he wants to become a part of. And for most of the poem, and also here, he seems to be more fundamentally interested in Eastern religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, than in Christianity. However, as I said previously, he later said that he found the Eastern religions a little foreign to his mentality, and he found it was easier to accept Christianity. And there is a later line by him, something like, I rejoice having constructed something on which to rejoice. So there is the idea of having constructed it. Not much, and of course it ends with the famous words shanti, 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 which one finds at the end of prayers in the Upanishads. It's a little bit like the word amen in the Christian religion, the peace that passes all understanding. It's a tour de force, but it's a technical tour de force. He's already said everything he has to say before this section, and this is just really the craftsman winding everything up in a way that is satisfactory, and that everybody will say, oh yeah, that's a nice way to end the poem. I think all the real heartfelt stuff came earlier. That's not to say there's not things that he truly believed here, but he has a hard job on his hands to come to a conclusion when he doesn't, artistically, when he doesn't actually have any conclusion mentally. So, good way to end the poem, considering the situation. Not a lot of Greek poetry in this section. There is the part about the lady pulled her long black hair out tight, and what was it? played whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings. This is rather nice. Most of this section is in free verse, and it's by its nature very fragmentary. It's jumping from place to place all the time, from idea to idea, from quotation to quotation. These fragments, I am sure, against my ruin. It's an admirable way to end the poem, but not at the same. It's not at the same level as the other sections of the poem. In my opinion, it's much more constructed in a craftsman-like way, with the intention of getting out and giving this piece, like a symphony, this symphonic piece, a final movement that makes sense when Eliot doesn't actually have any final answers at this stage in his life. So I hope that is useful, and they're really my thoughts about this section. I don't know if I will make another video talking about the poem as a whole. Perhaps I will, perhaps I won't. I've said most of what I need to say, so thank you for listening, and goodbye.